Thank you for joining us for this morning's program on Colorado's Economic Outlook with Dr. Richard Wobbekind. I'm Claire Noble, the Director of Programming for the Vail Symposium. On behalf of Chris Sable, our Executive Director, Dale Mosier, our Board Chairman, and the entire Vail Symposium Board, welcome. We're in our 49th year of providing thought-provoking and affordable programming to the Vail community. A few items to be aware of before we get started. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see an option for Q&A. Please type your questions in there at any time. We'll be addressing those questions during the program as well as at the end of the program. So again, you can type your questions in there for Dr. Wobbekind at any time. Today's program will run until 10 a.m. It's being recorded, and you'll be able to find that recording at both vailsymposium.org as well as on the Vail Valley Partnership website, because this program is presented in collaboration with the Vail Valley Partnership, our regional Chamber of Commerce and Community Development Organization. I've also placed in the chat the Colorado economic forecast that is really going to capture a lot of what Dr. Wobbekind is saying this morning. So if you want to refer back to that, the link to that document is in the chat. Also, Dr. Wobbekind has agreed to make his slides available, so we'll be posting those to vailsymposium.org as well. Our virtual programs are sponsored by Alpine Bank, and I'd like to take just a moment to thank some of the sponsors that have made this program possible. Our sponsors include the Town of Vail, Vail Resorts Epic Promise, the Antlers at Vail, and the Vail Daily. Jeannie and Dale Mosier have underwritten the winter season, and today's program was underwritten by Verna and Tom Howard. The Vail Symposium is also supported by a generous grant from the Frechette Family Foundation. Thank you to all of our sponsors and underwriters. I'd like to let you know about a program we have coming up on Thursday, April 1st at 6 p.m. We welcome Dr. James Baker of the University of Michigan for an examination of how viruses evade the immune system. Now we turn our attention to Colorado's economic outlook. Our distinguished guest is Dr. Richard Wobbekind, the Associate Dean for Business and Government Relations, Associate Professor of Business Economics and Finance, and Faculty Director of the Business Research Division at the Leeds School of Business at the University of Colorado at Boulder. One last reminder to please use the Q&A option to submit your questions for today's speaker, and we'll be sharing those throughout the program. And with that, I hand the program over to Dr. Richard Wobbekind.
Hopefully you're seeing my initial slide, and I will appear now as well. It's great to be here with you today, and I very much appreciate the invitation. Of course, like most people, I would rather be there live in your beautiful community, but the world is the way the world is. So hopefully not for too much longer. So the title that I gave about a month ago is How Long is the Road to Recovery? And I'm thinking more now when we talk about this, we're really looking at sort of an economic recovery in motion, if you will. And of course, that has a lot to do with the fact that the vaccine has been rolling out at a pretty rapid pace, not without some disruptions, but that has certainly helped bring us along. In the last month or two, the economic data have improved significantly. As was mentioned, this follows along with our outlook. That you have the link to that, so I'm not going to say too much about that. This particular booklet covers every sector of the economy. This was our 56th annual that we released in December, but quite honestly, we're updating the data, pretty much monthly. So you'll see things in here that are either monthly or weekly updates since we actually released the forecast back in December. It's just things are happening so rapidly. We've had to rely on a lot more in-time kinds of data. What economists have, business economists have called high frequency data. So I'll talk a little bit about that as we go along and as we go through the pieces. The focus is Colorado, and that is true, but the actual presentation slides are in 4 pieces, and I really don't think I'm going to be able to get to the all 4 pieces. I don't intend to, but as was mentioned by Claire, I am giving the presentation to the symposium to post. So you'd be able to look at the slides that I don't address. I think a lot of them are sort of self-explanatory. Tell you more about that as we go along. So again, at this point, you're saying, what is that light at the end of the tunnel? And in your beautiful area, you know these tunnels exist with trains and train tracks. And uh, I'm much more in favor of the left-hand view, that it's a bright, sunny kind of outlook. It's just a little bit down the track, as opposed to the view of, let's wait for the next shoe to fall. The light at the end of the tunnel is the train coming in the other direction. So I'm going to be, I think, pretty upbeat in this forecast, but also hopefully pretty realistic in terms of the battles that we're facing. And when you see the magnitude of these numbers coming, that we'll start in a moment, you'll understand, I think, in a little bit more, with a little bit more detail, why I'm saying what I'm saying. So with that, let me start by saying the presentation is broken up into sort of these 4 sections that I alluded to. First one deals with the national economy with some of the state sort of mixed in. The second piece really focuses on the state of Colorado and the sectors and a couple of key sectors specifically for your area of the state of Colorado. The third piece is focuses on some data for ski counties and for Eagle County. So that piece, hopefully I'll get to that, or you'll have that information as a reference point as we go forward. And then the last piece, what are some of the key indicators that we're looking at? So again, given the time and given your attention, I probably will not go through all of these, and I really do want to stop periodically to take questions. So please do enter those questions in the Q&A. So this is something that you've been living, this incredible drop in GDP, and then this incredible surge back in the third quarter. Fourth quarter looking, a little bit more tepid in terms of the recovery, but year over year, we're down about 2.4% in 2020. That said, we passed a stimulus bill in December where the impacts were felt in January, and we passed another one in March where we're going to see the impacts in late March or in April. And all of that stimulus is putting us on a road to recovering the GDP probably by the third quarter of this year. So we'll get back to the same level of GDP as we were at in the fourth quarter of 2019 in the third quarter of 2021. So that's a pretty rapid recovery, as you will see on the GDP side or the output side. The concern is on the employment side in terms of how long is it going to take to get everybody back in place. So looking at this in what looks like a pretty horrific picture, you can see the drop off in employment, and you can see sort of the V. People are talking about all the different letters of the alphabet describing the recovery. A V, a K, an L, a U. We've got almost every alphabet letter someone is talking about. But when you're looking at the recovery in terms of employment, it looks more like a check mark or the swoosh, as we've been calling it, without endorsing any particular product. And you can see we've had a nice recovery in employment, and we had a very strong month in February with the February data, as was highlighted. But even with that, the number is still down 9.5 million jobs from where we were at the peak in February. So we're still looking at, 1 year later, we're down 9.5 million jobs. So this is obviously an area of concern, and it's particularly an area of concern because the jobs are focused in a couple of categories, and you happen to, of course, have a very strong workforce base in one of those categories. The ski counties, the tourism base of the state. So more about that as we go along. So until the February data, just to put this again, recovery in some perspective, until the February data, we were down a larger percentage of jobs than we were ever down in the last recession, the so-called Great Recession, that took us all the way until 2014 to get back to the same level of employment. So it took us 6 years to get back to the same level of employment as we had going into this. And now I'm telling you, after the February data, we're not down as deep in that hole, but we are still down 6.2%. So how long does it take? Well, it doesn't take 6 years like the last time, but it probably takes 3 years or 3.5 years. So you're probably looking at the recovery to get back to that same number of jobs, the same employment level. You're probably looking into 2023 at this point. And again, more about that in a moment. But again, nowhere near the crisis of 2008 to 2014 in terms of the recovery path. Well, why? Well, a different kind of economic recession. You know this story. Why a quicker recovery? Tremendous monetary and fiscal response. But perhaps the most important piece of the picture is we entered this downturn in a much stronger financial position than we did in 2008. Households were not as heavily levered. Banks were on much stronger footing. So the 2008 recession quickly became a financial recession as the housing market collapsed and banking system struggled. Households filed for bankruptcy and so on. And now we are seeing this particular time around much stronger financial footing, and those types of indicators are on much more solid footing. In fact, to say something that you'll see in graphs along the way here, numerous times you'll see me talking about the housing market and housing prices appreciating, not declining. So even if people are in trouble in terms of making monthly payments, they should be able to exit their home in a very at a very reasonable price and not be underwater, if you will, on their mortgage. So moving along, employment growth, Colorado sort of in the middle on this, about 26th in the overall picture. And again, we went into this in the top 5 sort of position. So we have been a little bit slower in the recovery. People are linking some of the states with the most rapid recoveries to less time being shut down. That does appear to be roughly sort of correlated, but there are other factors as well. And if you look at other sort of key indicators in terms of cases per capita or in terms of deaths per capita, Colorado is one of the sort of best states. So maybe we locked down a little bit more than some other states, but we also suffered less in terms of the impacts of coronavirus on our health and on our lives. It has affected different groups at different levels. You can see the peak in red, you can see the low point in green, and you can see in the middle there a position of where we are right now as of the February unemployment rates. But you can see particularly the young, the less educated, some ethnic groups, and also women, females had a bigger impact on this particular economic downturn. The unemployment rate at the national level has dropped all the way back to 6.2%. It was at 3.5% or so going into this. So that, it's still highly elevated from the sort of February number of a year ago, but it has come down rather rapidly. So people are looking at that and saying, well, the recovery is coming on really fast for the labor market. But it's deceptive, as I said to you, because we have 9.5 million fewer jobs. And one of the reasons why the unemployment rate has gone down so much is that we've seen a significant drop off in labor force participation. We've seen the overall rate has dropped off, but in particular, the female participation rate dropped significantly, so much so that people have written articles calling this the she session as opposed to recession. Females more likely to be in occupations that were impacted. A higher percentage of female employment occurs in the professions that were impacted, but also more likely to be a primary provider in the home in terms of education, childcare, or relatives or parental care, well documented by many studies. So the combination of factors really has impacted the female participation in the workforce significantly. So what happened? Well, what was really different this time? I mentioned the unprecedented fiscal stimulus. you can see as we went into the shutdown of the economy in March and April, we had the first stimulus that came out. And you can see personal income overall rose at the most rapid rate that we'd seen month over month, attributable to the green. The green is the transfer receipts. This is the additional compensation coming from unemployment insurance from the federal government, plus the state unemployment insurance, plus the tax rebate checks that many people saw. And you can see again, all the way out in January, the most recent data that we have for personal income, the same thing happened in January with the second round of stimulus checks and the expansion of unemployment. So those particular financial events have really kept the GDP juiced, if you will, and consumption at pretty solid levels. We did see, however, people always want to ask this particular question. We did see, however, a real surge in savings as well as a drop in consumption and with this increase in personal income. So the top line shows you the income. The middle line shows you the consumption expenditures dropping and then coming back up. And then the bottom line shows you this big increase in savings, both in the April, when we had the April rebate checks, but also you can see the impact of the January rebate checks. So this calls into question the policy of giving these rebate checks to as large a piece of the population as we're giving them to. I have an opinion on this, which will come out and be obvious, but we know that the low income bracket is definitely spending the money. The middle income bracket is spending a portion of the money. And we know that the high income bracket is spending very little of these checks to putting it into savings. So in terms of stimulating the economy, this is not, is not as effective. The marginal propensity to consume of high income individuals is much lower and has been reflected in the data that we've seen. We also know that part of the reason people are able to consume is their household wealth, which has remained strong with the financial markets and housing staying strong. And we also know that household debt burden based on low interest rates has really fallen significantly. So there are a lot of things that are helping consumption in the economy right now. So we look at this picture and we see national retail and food services sales, and you can see the horrendous drop off in when things were shuttered, and you can see the movement up in April. You can see the movement up in January when we had the last rebate check, and now you see February's numbers where it's going down. So I anticipate with the issuance of the checks this month, they're already out in some places, and the beginning of April, that you'll see retail sales again begin to rise. So this is the picture February over February, where the retail sales are actually going. And the last slide, I showed you that they were up year over year. They were up over 6% on average. But you see that certain categories are getting a lot of activity, are up dramatically, like sporting goods, building materials, people fixing up their homes, food and beverage, and so on. And then you see at the bottom, we're looking at things like food services and drinking places in the leisure and hospitality segment, clothing and department stores, again, with dramatic drop-offs from a year ago. So hopefully as the economy reopens, we start to see more foot traffic. There are some documented pieces of this in terms of restaurants, and assuming we can keep the virus under control or the additional spread of the virus under control, which I still think is a little bit of an open question if you're watching the data on a day-to-day basis. But if we can do that, you would anticipate, again, a recovery in terms of the food and drinking and some of the larger format retail. In Colorado overall through December, we're up 2.3% in terms of retail sales tax collections. The cities over there on the right are places that we can get data from based on either their tax collection records or the state's tax collection records. So you can see the highlight here is that there was a great variation on sales tax receipts. Places that had big box retailers and had large outdoor venues for retail tended to do well. Other places with closed malls or far less big box retail sales dropped off fairly significantly. So we have had sort of disparities, even though through December, the overall number is up 2.3%. I would highlight, we do have January's numbers, and we had a decline in January. So January of 2021 is lower than January of 2020. So we're not out of the woods yet, but certainly this is a more optimistic picture than we painted back in April and May when things dropped off so dramatically, as you can see by the circled area. A couple of more comments on the national economy, and then I will take a quick break for questions. We hear a lot about construction, and construction is important to your area as well. The national value of construction up 4.7%, and you can see a lot of it was in the residential component in the bottom. I put these slides in here so you have some context for construction numbers. What we've seen, however, in terms of the national numbers is that the non-residential construction numbers have gone up in things like power, public safety, water supply, a lot of things that were CARES Act related, and we've seen a decline in things in the bottom like manufacturing construction and lodging construction. So even with that overall slight increase in this category of non-residential, it's really a lot of it has to do with sort of infrastructure and safety types of investments, as opposed to what a lot of us might consider more conventional construction like lodging or manufacturing facilities or office space. I don't want to dwell on this, but I do think this is an issue for the long run, and perhaps we can talk about this in the Q&A when we get a little further along. So quick comments on some money and prices, and then my first break in the action. The Federal Reserve stepped in quickly, not without criticism, and agreed to prop up virtually every financial market that was out there, including junk bond status. They basically, I would say, they basically took the stance that we will not let financial markets fail this time, and we're going to prop up whatever needs to be propped up. In doing so, they dramatically built up their balance sheet. But you can see also part of that big buildup in the balance sheet was buying federal government debt, the Treasury securities, which are the bottom kind of brownish tannish color. And you can see how much of those they're holding now, just slightly under $5 trillion of federal debt they're holding just in terms of Treasury securities. So they've had a very active role in keeping the economy afloat, along with, again, the very strong fiscal stimulus from the federal government. Nonetheless, they're not as active in the market right now as they've been, and we have had either indications that people are optimistic about the economy growing at really high rates, and so that's part of the reason maybe they're building in interest rate increases in the 10-year that we've seen kind of rocket up in the last month. The Fed has continued to maintain that they will keep short-term rates down in the zero at the lower bound, 0 to 0.25 range, but they have also said they're paying attention to the bond markets, and they might do some things in the bond markets, but they're certainly not sort of worried about that at this particular point in time. So you could argue that that 10-year rate is reflecting strong economic growth, or you could argue, as some people are saying, it's reflecting a concern about higher levels of inflation down the line. We've seen a little bit of an escalation. Will we see more of an escalation in 2022 and 2023? Still, when you look at the 30-year mortgage rate, which is the top line there, yes, it has gone back up to just a little over 3% range, but still this is, in historical context, still a very, very modest or low rate, and still portends, I think, solid things for the housing market. What continues to be a concern in Colorado particularly is the level of inflation. And we continue to be year after year having a higher inflation rate than the country as a whole. So we want to look at this particular information and sort of process it and say, what does this actually mean for us? Why is our inflation rate higher? For a number of years, it had to do with our shelter being more expensive, our housing. But now we really are appreciating, at a much more normal pace vis-a-vis the nation. For some years, it was medical costs, but not recently. So the question is still out there. Why are we seeing, higher inflation rate in Colorado than the nation as a whole? Could be because of the strength of our economy going into this, and again, a very tight labor force. But this is one of the things we need to think about. So as I move on to Colorado, I am going to ask Claire, are there any questions out there that people might like to have comments on?
Yes, Dr. Wobbekind, there's a lot of concern about the national debt. And let me just go to Merv's question because he specifically asks, how does the huge debt affect the stock market, price of gold, real estate, other hard assets, liquidity of loans, et cetera?
Yeah, so I mean, in the long run, so macroeconomists like myself would say the biggest concern, number one, is that this shaves off growth in the overall economy over the longer haul. Servicing that level of debt in some way, shape, or form could be higher taxes, might likely be higher taxes, um, certainly constrains the long-term economic growth. So that's my number one sort of concern with that question. As long as there's all of this liquidity still out there in the system, I don't think it's really impacting real estate in the short run, or the stock market and the real estate and those types of assets are getting sort of propped up by the liquidity that's out there. But you could argue that people are concerned that the debt ultimately has an inflationary effect on the economy, and I think many macroeconomists believe that. So that if that servicing that debt winds up having an inflationary impact on the economy, that of course affects the value of those broad assets, as they react to higher levels of inflation in the economy. So it does have an impact. For me, it is a concern, and I know we needed to do a lot of these things that we're doing. I just wish there was a little bit more thought that went into some of it.
And then John is concerned about whether or not your forecasts have taken into account the impact of the proposed Biden administration tax increases. And if not, what would you anticipate that impact to be?
So it did back in December. We had election results at that time, and we, under the anticipated scenario, there's a lot of modeling that's out there on this topic. It doesn't actually seemingly change economic output very much in terms of where the taxes. It has some impact on corporations, clearly on large corporations. The tax on the wealthy doesn't seem to create much in terms of economic slowdown. And when you put that into sort of a dynamic model vis-a-vis the level of debt that we've accrued, a lot of that tax revenue helps offset some of the debt payments. And so it's really the payback. So this is what I was alluding to in my prior answer. You are giving up future growth when you accrue this kind of debt. But at this point, I don't think we can continue to ignore the size of this debt in terms of, servicing it. We still have the position as the world's, currency. We need to sort of maintain that, and I think the debt brings that into a little bit more question, at least in some circles.
Mark asks, when do you expect a negative impact will be experienced in the economy due to the increasing the money supply? Additionally, what industries will experience a pullback?
Oh, so that's a really tough one. So the increase in the money supply, I think has inflated a lot of assets. So when you see the impact of that, it's going to be bringing the money supply more into a constrained growth path. At least that's sort of my view. And when that happens, you are going to start to see interest rates moving up, again, as a function of both monetary policy, but also debt servicing. So as interest rates start to move up, you'd have to argue that the sectors that are more interest rate sensitive are going to feel, larger impacts. What might that be? Well, certainly housing is one of those. Construction is in the broad sense. Um, Areas where people have to borrow a lot, like automobiles perhaps, or durable goods where people are buying those things on with interest payments over a longer period of time. So interest sensitive items will probably get impacted the most. Again, I think that's sort of years out into the future, as I was just showing. The burden on households now is very low, and the interest rates rising, they're rising, but they're still well below historical rates.
I may have misspoken earlier. Merv has sent me a note saying gold. Perhaps I didn't say price of gold. I guess that's one of the questions he had about the debt and the price of gold.
Well, historically, people think of the price of gold as a hedge against inflation. And so the price of gold, if the debt has this inflationary impact, then you would expect the price of gold to continue to rise. It is one of those things that, there are other hedges out there. So people are, it's not maybe as directly correlated as it was in the past. You could be buying other minerals as inflationary hedge. It depends on if your view is that, yes, we have this inflationary pressure, but it's caused by incredible growth, global growth at that point, as well as the debt. Well, then commodities are, commodity prices should be rising. So commodities are typically a hedge. All right.
I know you were just talking about interest rates. Emily has asked the question. She points out the Treasury is financing debt with very low interest rates. What might cause those rates to go up significantly?
Well, the short-term rate, again, is the Federal Reserve is controlling that. So it would be some policy that they would enact. They have been very clear that they're not planning on doing that before 2023. They've been very clear in their latest directives, particularly last August, that they're not going to try to anticipate inflation. They're going to wait till they see it. So, and then they're going to do inflation averaging. But I mean, the big issue is what could cause those, the short-term rate to go up would definitely be a very bullish economy and much higher inflation rates, where they would have to step in after some period of time, a year and a half from now, or whenever that may be, and raise those short-term rates. The long-term rates are more under market control. And again, that would be a reaction to higher inflation, but also to a bullish economy.
Do you have time for one more question before you move on?
Well, I do, but I'm not going to be able to do much of the rest of the presentation, but that's fine. Do one more. People are
Okay,
asking.
so Cookie, I think, asks a very important question, and that is, how about those folks affected by, she indicates 10 million jobs that are reportedly not coming back. How do we as a country support those folks until they can be retrained or find new jobs? Would it be extra unemployment benefits?
So that is a good question, and it does come up maybe a little bit more in this next section where I'm going to talk about Colorado. But sometimes you hear this described as a K-shaped recovery, because it's a land of it's two different outcomes, and you'll see that in some of my slides as I go forward here a little bit more. When we look at this particular outcome, you see that the low income, lower wage categories were impacted much more significantly. And during this time, places like restaurants figured out how to do things with fewer workers to automate some of their processes and so on. So we do have a category of workers that are not going to be able to go back into the jobs they came out of. And you would hope that we will have extended retraining going on for those folks, because they're going to be the structurally unemployed. So the question is a very good one, and I do think it's retraining, because we're going to get back to the same level of employment, but we're not going to get to the same level of employment distribution by industry. 2 years out, we're going to get back, or 2.5 years out, we're going to get back to the number of jobs, but not the distribution. The jobs in these low wage categories are not anticipated to hit the same level until 2024 or 2025. So those people will either be chronically unemployed, which is not a good thing, and extended unemployment is going to help, but the real issue is retraining, getting them back into the workforce, and giving them an opportunity to be in a higher wage occupation with a greater rate of return. Some of the other pieces relate to other sorts of program pieces as well. So again, trying to be being respectful of the time, I do want to hit the Colorado section here fairly quickly and make sure I leave at least a few minutes at the end for you to ask more questions. So Colorado has seen a slowdown in population growth. This coincides with what we've seen at the national level, 0.35% for the nation in 2020. This is lower birth rates, higher death rates, some of which of course was related to the virus. So we had a slower natural rate of increase nationally and in Colorado, but we also saw a lower rate of in-migration to the country over the last several years. So the combination of those factors had population growth in the US at 0.35% for a year, very, very slow population growth rate. So going forward, we'll see maybe some of the immigration things will change. Certainly we can hope that the natural rate of increase changes with control of the virus and maybe people feeling more comfortable about having families or having children. But Colorado, nonetheless, we anticipate a sort of slowdown. And then this slide is included in there to just give you a sense of what the state demographer thinks is going to happen in terms of population growth. Eagle County is in the slightly positive tan area. I have a reference to this later on in the section that's on the ski counties as well. So you can sort of see that piece, but they still think the majority of the population growth occurs in the Front Range sort of area. Employment growth, we came out in December, and as I've been mentioning, there's so many uncertain factors in this forecast. We have never done this before. We do this in all of our econometric forecasting. We're doing a lot of forecasting for cities and for transportation districts and so on. And we're always forecasting with a range for those folks. But our annual forecast, we usually come out with a number, even though we have a range in our forecast. We never sort of give the range, and we just sort of say, this is our point. And you can see our points from the years gone by. Those are the actuals at this point. We came out this year and said 40 plus or minus over 20, because that's what the model was showing, this incredible distribution possibilities given on which scenario you anticipated in the forecast. We did say in the forecast that we were going to be for 2020 minus 145,000 jobs, and the revised data that just came out, including the employment data for January for Colorado, but the revision of the 2020 data that just came out shows the state down 143,000 or so for the year. So very close on that number, unfortunately. A lot of jobs to bring back to the broader economy. This shows you for the MSAs where we've seen the least job loss and the most job loss through January. And you can see Boulder and Greeley over there on the right for the metropolitan statistical areas. Grand Junction had been up right close to zero in terms of the employment for a long period of time. But when the revision just came out, they went down to sort of being in the middle of the pack. So you can see some of the areas that have historically, at least, not been the strongest growth areas, like Colorado Springs, have lost the least amount of jobs. And some of the stronger areas like Greeley, Weld County, Greeley MSA, have really fallen in terms of their job growth year over year. One of the concerns that's still out there is the initial unemployment claims. And I didn't have this slide at the national level, but I did want to show you this slide at the state level. And I will tell you, if I don't get there, that this is also, there's a comparable slide later in the presentation for the ski counties. So you can see the initial rise in claims, then the drop off, and then you can see how that has went back up in November and December with the secondary shutdown, and now how that's come down a little bit since. There are issues here with fraudulent claims. They have taken a lot of those and fixed those and taken it out of the data. Nonetheless, you can see on the far right-hand side, we still continue to have very elevated levels of continuing jobless claims. And as people are becoming more and more long-term unemployed, and as some retail businesses in particular cease to operate, we're starting to see again those jobs not coming back anytime in the near future, or having perhaps been automated away in reference to the earlier question. Unemployment rate by county, the best counties have the lowest rates are in those red counties out on the Eastern Plains. At first, we saw the ski counties with the highest numbers by far. Now you can see that has moderated. You're sort of in the middle in terms of the overall rate, but Colorado still remains elevated. We had numbers in December that had us at over 8%, which frankly, we had a hard time believing. And when the January data came out, those numbers were revised down into the high 6% range. The January number at 6.6%, still we're above the national average in terms of our unemployment rate. We're in the 30s in terms of state ranking, in terms of the unemployment rate. So we have had more difficulty with this particular recession so far. We're very optimistic that in the months ahead, we'll see quite a bit of recovery, as we've seen positive effects of the corona rollout, and seeing continued upgrades and openings, as we've seen even this week. So we do anticipate sort of an acceleration, if you will, of job growth in the months ahead. But you still have issues of when do you go back to sort of normal capacity? For the ski industry, obviously they didn't have that this year. Hopefully it'll be in place for next year, but you do have some of these lingering effects. So here's the employment change year over year by sector. And you can see at the very bottom, accommodations and food services. Again, this is leisure and hospitality, the food industry and restaurants, then government, overall government employment, and then arts, entertainment, and recreation. This is where you get the river rafters. This is where, anybody, you get the performing arts, then the Denver Center for Performing Arts, or your local Vail Valley Performing Arts, or, all of those types of industries have been very, very hard hit by this downturn. And at the top end, you can see transportation and utilities, finance and insurance are the categories that have really done well. Management of companies and enterprises, these tend to be all higher wage jobs. These are also jobs that could be done more easily remotely. So as opposed to the bottom categories there, where we see a lot of face-to-face interaction. So this led to this sort of K-shaped thing I was alluding to earlier, where you see the low-income industries where average wage is below 50. This is generated out of our office just for Colorado, based on Colorado wage industries. And you can see with the dip in December, then the rise back in January, we're still down over 10% in terms of jobs in the lower income industries. We're down about 4% in the middle income industries, and we're down about 1.5% to 2% in the high income industries. So it has been very disparate in terms of who's been hit. And again, when will you see the recovery, or will those jobs come back in those at the same level in those low income industries? There's another group nationally, a very well-known group out of MIT, Opportunity Insights. You can get a graphic like this. They do it with different proprietary data sets that they can get to, but it shows you very sort of similar things, that the lowest wage category group has been hit very, very hard by this. So some comments on tourism, a key industry, obviously, for your area. And we've seen, although this number looks horrible, uh, DIA through December was the third busiest airport in the US. The January numbers look very promising. So we do seem to see a pretty strong recovery here. And you have probably seen the numbers for people traveling in the last week or so. We've started to see a lot more people flying over spring break and so on. We'll see whether that has any health repercussions, but it certainly is seemingly bringing the tourism industry back at a pretty rapid rate. We saw an increase in public land visits, and we expect that again. Again, this relates to specifically impacts of summer tourism. So we're optimistic that summer tourism, car tourism will be strong, also important for your area and a lot of the western parts of Colorado. So we do think that will be strong and help to bring back again with a more open economy, bring back prior levels of sort of spending and visitation. National snow sports, I sort of mentioned this last year, 1920, a tough season. 2021 is going to also clock in as a pretty rough season due to operational inefficiencies created by spacing and so on. So this is, again, an area that we're hopeful at 21, 22, we'll see a really nice spring back. Still, the overall population of employment in leisure and hospitality pretty weak in the overall picture. And we did see, again, a decline November, December, a bounce back in January, but still down well over 20%. Key sector for you. A couple of comments on construction. Home prices, we still have some of the higher appreciation MSAs in the country, including Pueblo and Colorado Springs. But of course, the places that have had higher price appreciation have been some of the lower priced areas, and the MSAs with the high priced areas like Boulder and Fort Collins have seen much lower rates of appreciation. Overall, our FHFA home prices have been much more modest compared to our historical national ranking. So we have seen a slowdown in overall shelter appreciation in Colorado in the last, frankly, year and a half, 2 years. Our overall value of construction, you can see overall total was up 3.6%, but this was driven very heavily by residential. We saw declines in both non-residential and non-building, although overall we saw more optimistic numbers for, if you excluded Denver, Boulder, Fort Collins, and Greeley MSAs, the state did better. So we see more or healthier construction levels in other parts of the state. And you can see that in that very tiny bar in the bottom right-hand corner. You can see year-to-date for 2021, a pretty dramatically statewide, excluding northern MSAs, less so for just the entire state. Again, residential building permits strong in 2020. Our committee actually thinks in 2021 they'll be down slightly, and they built in rising mortgage rates into their forecast. They built in the coronavirus having a lag on the housing market. We'll see whether or not they're right about that. But excluding the northern MSAs, the number up even more dramatically. So this is what you saw, and unfortunately the data really lags. You had a very strong 2019. We don't have the 2020 number yet for Eagle County. We're anticipating a pattern similar to the outer parts of the state. We have seen amenity-based migration to a lot of parts of the state, beautiful areas like your own. So we do think that will keep the sort of residential sector healthy. And then these slides relate to the ski counties in general. So I'm going to hit a couple of them, and then I'm going to stop and take questions for the remainder. So this is the population change overall that is anticipated from the state demographer's office, including the number for Eagle for 2019 and 2020. Again, the source here is the State Demography Office and the US Census. So we are using consistent numbers across, and you can see in prior recessions, you have had some periods of a negative net migration. We don't anticipate that in this particular downturn. Your migration numbers are still remaining positive. Initial unemployment claims, you can see that we are tracking here. The blue is the ski countries, sorry, excuse me, ski counties. You can see a more dramatic increase and then a quick sort of drop off. And then now you are sort of paralleling the same movement, and you additionally have a same sort of movement in terms of the continuing claims. So you don't have quite the unemployment rates, but you still had, again, the same sort of dramatic effects where we saw tourism greatly impacted. And then we look at the unemployment rates, and you can see this is for all counties in the US. So you can sort of see that there are counties with a lot more higher unemployment. But if you look at the ski counties in particular, you can see that we're in the sort of middle or further to the right, especially the ones out in your area. You can see more attractive, if you will, unemployment rates. Again, some of these ski, some of these related to tourism more broadly, including gambling or casinos, well, summer sports like river rafting and so on. So you can see that sort of wider piece on the right. And you can also see that some of the employment changes going through January, Chaffee actually had an increase, as did Archuleta. But you can also see that in general, the ski counties have done a little bit better in terms of their employment change year over year, with the exception to the far right of San Juan and San Miguel counties. So when we look at the industry location quotients, what are the industries that you should be most focused on? Well, you dramatically overshare in leisure and hospitality. Again, this includes restaurants, hotels, accommodations, arts, entertainment, and recreation is a subcategory of this one. And you greatly overshare in terms of construction. In financial activities, you slightly overshare. And then everything else, you're either right there or you undershare a little bit. So again, the things to pay most attention to, of course, are the recovery in leisure and hospitality. And again, the recovery in construction. When will there be construction that relates to not just residential, but also to non-residential? What we've seen in other tourism economies that we've looked at, we've been doing, I've done a number of these presentations in more, Chaffee County and Glenwood and so on. We've seen the construction industry being very much bimodal, the residential area being still remaining healthy, but the non-residential projects, many of them being put on hold. So again, something to follow in terms of your local economy. You tend to be a very high wage area. These are just, again, the ski counties. You're below the state average, but you're higher than every other ski county with the exception of Pitkin in terms of your average annual wage. What's interesting though is, of course, you've lost, this is September over September. So this is looking at much more reliable, this is employment data as opposed to unemployment data. The employment data lags significantly. So we only have through the third quarter. And through the third quarter, you were down 3,700 jobs, or about 11.2% year over year through the end of September. So again, your unemployment rate has moved back into sort of a normal range. We would anticipate your employment has been going up in the third quarter, at least a little bit. I'm sorry, in the fourth quarter, at least a little bit. in October, November, and December. These last couple of slides, this just shows you that a lot more people commute in than commute out of Vail and also in Eagle County. And with that associated, you get a personal income outflow associated with those 11,000 folks that are commuting out of Eagle County. Personal income, I'm looking at the time, so I'll just sort of hit those. And then household income. So there's a couple of slides for you to refer to in this last part of the presentation in terms of income in the area. So I am stopping here. I'm not going to move on to the indicators. Again, you can access the broader indicators, but this leaves at least a few minutes for questions. Thank you.
And I just want to point out to our audience, a few people have asked the question, we will be posting these slides to our website, and this presentation will be is recorded and it'll be posted to our website as well as the VVP website. Wanted to bring up a question or a comment by Mark, who says that wages would likely be artificially inflated right now due to the large number of frontline low-wage workers out of the market, inflating what you would see locally. Do you agree with that statement?
Yes, absolutely. When you look at the average wage, I have this slide with more recent data at the state level. Believe it or not, there are slides I actually took out of this presentation, but that clearly shows wages in the low income bracket rising, because even in the lower wage sectors rising, because you're dropping off so many low wage people. So yes, that is true. It's artificial in that sense, that because of the disparity of low wage jobs lost compared to high wage jobs lost.
I was a little surprised to see when you were throwing up the unemployment slides, the large numbers of losses within government. And I'm wondering if those are towns and cities that had to lay off workers due to decrease in tax revenues from sales taxes, for instance, from lodging, from retail.
Yes, so the overall employment impacts are at the state level in terms of government. There's three brackets: federal, state, and local. Federal government employment has held up. We haven't seen impacts at the labs. We had the census. Both state government and local government have had job losses. There's been a lot of paring at the state government level due to the drop off in revenues that were experienced due to the downturn. The downturn in revenue hasn't been as severe as initially forecast, but it's still down. We saw pretty significant losses in education, both at the state level and the local level. And yes, it is cities and counties who had revenue drop-offs and had to pare a percentage of their workforce. My home base here in Boulder, they have pared their workforce to local government. So you're absolutely right with that assumption.
The latest stimulus package is supposed to have money for states, counties, and cities. So do you anticipate those people being hired back? Or do you think, like a lot of businesses, they've figured out ways to do more with fewer people?
That's a really good question. So I do anticipate some of those people will be hired back. Many of these communities put people on furlough as opposed to just said we're going to wait and see how things go. So I do think there'll be some rehiring, but I also think there will be restructuring. People have figured out how to do things with fewer people and may not need to hire. So those people may be reallocated to other areas that are in greater need. But I do think it was state and local governments, not just Colorado, needed assistance given the incredible drop off in revenues. As you probably know, almost every state budget operates under a balanced budget requirement, unlike the federal government. And so when you have this incredible drop off in resources, you don't have a lot of options on what you're going to be able to cut that isn't going to be actually cutting people. That's a very good question, and we don't know the answer yet, but we did see in the January numbers, I should highlight this, at the state level in the government sector, we did see a growth in government employment in January. So we're hopeful that at least the job losses have ended. Whether or not we'll get all those jobs back is still in question.
Well, we're really out of time. I told you earlier that I would give you the final word. One of the things we hear a lot now is, when will we get back to normal? So I guess I know you're optimistic about our outlook, but when do you think things will start to feel more normal economically?
So it's going to depend on, it's going to be in phases. I think for a lot of things, we're going to say, oh, this is normal by the fourth quarter of this year. People will be going back more to restaurants. People will be, going into work more frequently as opposed to telecommuting. But what we don't know as, quote, what's going to be normal is, what is the new normal? How many days a week will people actually work in the office? What does that mean for office space? What does that mean for retail in a downtown area of any community? Will people go back to their old forms of retail shopping, or will they have, gone on to this high level of commitment to e-commerce? So we need to go further out. I'm suggesting, into next year, to see how those patterns shake out. And in particular, it's not a direct impact in your area, but when will we return to business travel and conference travel as we had in the past? It's important for Colorado because we do have a lot of conference travel in the Denver and Colorado Springs area and so on. But it's important for the state because a lot of those people extend their visits when they come to Colorado and drive to other parts of the state and visit, our national monuments or our beautiful ski areas or whatever it might be. So this is an area we're very interested in seeing whether businesses go back to old ways of doing things. My guess is not. My guess is there'll be a lot fewer trips to visit regional offices from the home office of XYZ. And so we'll have long-term impacts on that part of the economy.
Dr. Wobbekind, thank you so much for your time and your expertise. We certainly appreciate it this morning. And everyone viewing this program, thank you for joining us this morning. Thank you to the Vail Valley Partnership, with whom we collaborated on this program. Again, this program is being recorded. You'll be able to find it at vailsymposium.org, as well as with the Vail Valley Partnership website, and we'll post these slides to our website. Thank you, and I hope you'll join us next week. On April 1st, we welcome Dr. James Baker of the University of Michigan. Thank you, and have a great day.